Good morning, honorable members, and those under the sound of my voice. This is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Today, in our Moments of Impact devotional segment, I want to share from this topic, Lord, heal our land. Over the past several days, there's been an increase in violent crimes and murder in our country. Every time I listen to the news or read the headlines on the dailies, when I hear of the murders, my heart aches. My heart aches because some family is shedding tears and experiencing loss. Just recently, last week, Thursday, one of the members of our church called my phone in tears. Her son was gunned down the night before. While in many quarters of our nation we are flourishing and prospering economically, daily it appears as though the moral and social fabric of our nation is disintegrating. With that being said, I believe every right-thinking Bahamian or citizen of this great country would agree that our land needs healing. We need healing from hatred, cold-heartedness, anger, bigotry, bitterness, jealousy, greed, pride, impatience, and the black crab syndrome. Before our nation spirals any further, we need the Lord to heal our land. 2 Chronicles chapter 7, verse 14 outlines one of the requirements for the Lord to heal our land. And it reads, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, and I will forgive their sins, and I will heal the land." If the Lord is going to heal our land, his people, the children of God, the church, must humble themselves and pray and seek his face and turn from their wicked ways. In conclusion, I want to send a clarion call to everyone who profess Jesus as Lord and Savior to let your walk match your talk. It's time out for playing church and having God on your lips, but far from your hearts. It's time to seek God for real, not for his hand, but for his heart, so that we can think like him, talk like him, and act like him. Our land is in need of healing. It's time for the real sons and daughters of God to stand up and take their rightful place. Selah, think and act on these things. Let us bow our hearts in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for your faithfulness and your loving kindness extended toward us daily. Lord, we come to you today as a nation with a simple prayer request, and that is to heal our land. Heal our land from this surge of crime and violence. We ask today, Almighty God, that your peace will prevail in our nation. May it prevail in our schools, our communities, our workplaces, our churches, and yes, Lord, even in this honorable house. We ask, Lord, that you would bring comfort to those who are bereaved during this time. Lord, we humbly ask you today to take control of our land. May we proclaim you as Lord and Master and ruler of our lives. And those of us who claim you as Lord, may we humble ourselves. May we pray. May we seek your face. And oh God, may we turn from our wicked ways. Lord, I repent on behalf of the church and this nation. And I ask you today to have mercy on us and forgive us from all unrighteousness. Now, Father, we ask that you would bless the proceedings of this house today. We pray for your wisdom, your knowledge, for these honorable members as they seek to chart the way forward for our nation. Oh Lord, continue to bless, protect, and preserve the great commonwealth of the Bahamas. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Let us repeat the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Philip Davis, Chester Cooper, Fred Mitchell, Glennis Hannah Martin, Obadiah Wilstrom, Alfred Sayers, Dr. Michael Darble, Clay Sweeting, Keith Bell, Wayne Monroe, Vaughn Miller, Jobeth Colby Davis, Ginger Moxie, Mario Boleg, Jomo Campbell, Basil McIntosh, Miles DeRoda, Tia Glover Rowe, Lisa Ramming, Zane Lightbourne, Dr. Hubert Minnis, Jamal Strawn, John Pinder, Marcus Roll, Leon Lundy, Kurt Cornish, Wade Watson, Leonardo Lightbourne, Leslie Miller Bryce, Leroy Major, Sylvanus Petty, Mikkel Bonnaby, Michael Pintard, James Kwesi Thompson, Aram Lewis, Shannon Dawn Cartwright, Adrian Gibson, Adrian White.
Good morning, honorable members. Before we begin this morning, I'd like to share with my constituents of Bamboo Town, if they would so desire, to please bring all of the bulk waste or all of the garbage out to the front of their yards. Bamboo Town is in full effect this morning as we have persons out collecting all of the debris and bulk waste, and I'd like to thank the Minister for Environment and the Honorable Member for Golden Isles for this esteemed opportunity for my constituency this morning. Also, I'd like to thank Engineer Beher. She's been working diligently fixing those potholes in Bamboo Town, and I'd like to send a complete thank you to her and to Engineer Francis Clark for making sure that Bamboo Town is on the schedule for much needed road works, and also to Engineer Henry Moxie for fixing that drain, in particular the one that it's right there on the heel of Pinewood. The people of Bamboo Town say thank you, and to the ministers with responsibility, I say thank you in this honorable place from my chair. I'd also like to say special congratulations to the chaplain of this honorable assembly, who would have celebrated 20 years of his pastoral anniversary last Sunday, and I'd like to say congratulations to him and his wife. Now, today we are debating the central bank bill, so let's get on with the people's business. Introduction and swearing in of new members. Laying of documents by ministers. Statement and communication by ministers. Communications by the clerk. Messages from the Governor General. Messages from the Senate. Motions for leave of absence, leave to resign seat, and new writs. Presentations of petitions. Presentations of reports of committees. Adoption of reports of committees. First reading of bills. Second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the honorable member for Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador.
Madam Speaker, I move for the second reading and passing of a bill for an act to amend the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act. Madam Speaker, today this bill we debate, the Central Bank of the Bahamas Amendment Bill 2023. I would like to start to address head-on the concerns raised by the opposition leader, the member for Marco City, the Honorable Member Michael Pintard, regarding our government's access to the $232 million of the International Monetary Fund's special drawing rights allocation and the subsequent amendment to the Central Bank Act. First and foremost, let me say that the SDR allocation is not a loan. And I'll be very kind by saying, as mistakenly assumed by the opposition. I'll come back to why I characterize it as mistakenly assumed by the opposition. The IMF has explicitly outlined that the SDRs are an interest-bearing reserve asset allocated to participants to provide unconditional liquidity during challenging times. This allocation was given to countries, including ours. We're not the only country to which this allocation was made, to alleviate funding concerns caused by the devastating COVID-19 pandemic. As responsible leaders, we are committed to utilizing these funds for their legitimate and intended purpose, as prescribed by the IMF in its guidance notes. To remove any doubt, we have taken a proactive measure to amend the Act addressing any ungrounded concerns as to the use of these funds. I must emphasize that our government has been transparent and accountable throughout this process. The governor of the central bank, Mr. John Rule, has confirmed our government's commitment to amending the Central Bank Act so as to remove any doubt as to the utilization of the IMF SDRs held as part of the external reserves. Furthermore, the central bank has worked closely with our government in concluding arrangements to access these much-needed funds, ensuring that we continue to serve our people and address the challenges presented by the ongoing pandemic. We understand the importance of fiscal responsibility, and we understand the need to adhere to the law. However, we must not lose sight of our primary goal, and that is to support and uplift our nation during unprecedented times. 2 weeks ago, we tabled the amendments to the Central Bank Act by withdrawing the initial bill that we had proposed, which dealt only with the SDRs, and we thought it fitting at the same time to do a further amendment to the Central Bank Act. And that further amendment was to limit the amount government can borrow from the central bank by approximately 50%. Government could have borrowed up to 30% of the available assets of the central bank as presently exists. We are now reducing that to 15.5% of the asset available. And again, all of this, when we are thinking about the relationship between the fiscal authority and the monetary authority, we thought that this would be a wise intervention to statutorily reduce the amount of monies that the fiscal authorities can borrow from the monetary authority. And so we are also, and in this regard, we are also prohibiting central bank purchases of government debt securities related to what I call the initial public offerings for public corporations. With these measures, we are creating more transparent processes, and we are ensuring that the central bank continues to be in line with the highest international standards. And I applaud the central bank leadership, including Governor Roll, for working with us to ensure that these steps are rolled out efficiently. There are very few institutions as important to our continued national success than the Central Bank of the Bahamas. So, Madam Speaker, The International Monetary Fund is an international organization that has 190 member nations, and the Bahamas is one of those nations. Special drawing rights were created by the IMF in 1969, and there have been 3 prior general allocations, the most recent of which was during the global financial crisis of 2009. That allocation was considered an important contributor to stabilizing the then international financial conditions. In August of 2021, in recognition that the pandemic was an enormous shock to the global economy, the IMF allocated $650 billion worth of special drawing rights. This was the largest, and I repeat, the largest, and I repeat this word, debt-free, largest debt-free form of support for low and middle income countries during the pandemic. And the intention was to help countries whose economies were dealt devastating blows by shutdowns, in recognition that all member countries would benefit from, and I borrow the IMF words, and I quote, a major effort to foster the resilience and stability of the global economy. The value of the assets allocated, that is the amount each country got, is proportionate to that nation's IMF quota shares, which is a reflection of a country's position within the global economy. Essentially, special drawing rights are the units by which a country's IMF share is measured. These assets can be held in their current form or converted. Countries are free to hold special drawing rights as part of their foreign exchange reserves, or to use them to bolster government's finances, or to, again, service the country's debt. The goal of SDRs is to provide a liquidity boost without, and I repeat the word, without raising debt burdens. I repeat, the goal of SDRs is to provide a liquidity boost without raising debt burdens. These assets, and I repeat, these assets are not loans. Access to these assets is facilitated through a voluntary arrangement between the IMF and member countries during times of global financial and economic difficulty. As mentioned earlier, I want to make that last point clear. This is not an IMF loan. It is an automatically allocated reserve that does not generate debt, does not require repayment to the IMF, and does not come with the conditions associated with IMF loan facilities. Now, Madam Speaker, I just hope that the opposition will be, honorable enough to accept. And I use the word mistakenly, I said, your mistaken assumption. Well, I use that word mistaken assumption because, the world is becoming a world of what I call lame brains with the advent of technology. If you have a question, you could just press a button and get the answer, If you have a question, you could press a button and get the answer. You don't have to think critically anymore. You don't have to do those research, and go through books. Just put the question in this device you call computer now, And the answer comes out. So when they were saying we break the law, we borrow money from the central bank, right? They could have gotten out of that shell of the lame brain. Just press a button. Press the button, and the answer was right there. Right there. They could have gone on the IMF, on the website, and guess what? Because press the button. Yeah. See, it's all right there. And guess what? The IMF understood that there might be, and they were prophetic. They probably knew how the opposition operated in the Bahamas. And so they decided, let us publish what this SDR is all about. And all they need to do, instead of coming in here, but that's what a responsible opposition will do. You know, my colleagues told me down in the other day, they said, don't worry about the opposition, you know. You were there, right? What they say? All they got to do, they only got 3 jobs. Oppose, expose, and depose. That's their job. And so, Madam Speaker, so this is something, what they were doing, they thought they were exposing. They're exposing that, well, the government led by me was breaking the law. The government led by me was borrowing more money, and we didn't do this and we didn't do that. We didn't follow it. But all you had to do as a responsible opposition, and see, you get caught, instead of me being exposed, you expose. Because you're misleading the public. See, all you have to do to avoid now what's happening to you, and I hope you'll be honorable enough to say, well, it was not a loan. It ain't no more loan. And look, and it was so detailed. Questions and answers on special drawing rights. The first question, what is an SDR? What is a general SDR allocation? Right? What are the purpose and benefits of the 2021 general SDR allocation? How many SDRs have been allocated so far? How did the 4th Amendment special allocation of SDRs come about? How much of a general allocation is distributed to each member? What happens to SDRs once they are allocated? What they can be used for? How will you keep track of the use of SDR allocation by countries and improve transparency? Right? Can existing SDRs be recycled or channeled for what other purposes? What are the options? Right? Then guess what? They have put many more questions. One of the specific questions they answered, they asked, is the SDR allocation a loan from the IMF? Wow. You were asking, you weren't saying you were saying that it was a loan. They come out of that shell of being a lame brain, press the button, the answer is right here for you. Go to the IMF website and the answer is here. So instead of exposing us about breaking the law and or drawing monies, why are you smiling? Look at Kalani smiling. You were quiet on this one, I know, because you understood. You pressed the button. Huh? You pressed it. You pressed the button. Yeah, Kalani said he pressed the button, so he knew it wasn't a loan. You see, but that's what you should have done, or ask someone, or just double check your. I don't know everything, so I just have to ask too sometimes. And so those people might be telling you who you ask. Don't let them set you up. And that's what I'm saying. So I trust that you will now be honorable enough to say what you've been saying before is really not the truth. And maybe you could take another tack later on. And so, Madam Speaker, for completeness, I'm going to lay this on the table, so for all to read and understand, because lame brains didn't mean lame fingers. You could have a lame brain but you could press a button and you'll get it. So
Google, man.
Google, that's all.
Google.
Order that the document be brought up.
And it has any questions you have on this question of STRs right here. There are 15 questions. 15. What's the date? Lay it on the table for you. All right, so, although
Order the document line on the table.
Madam Speaker, we have put the worst of the pandemic in our rearview mirror, the economic harm caused by the shutdowns and the curfews and the loss of tourism revenue continue to resonate. Opening up the economy quickly and ending curfews was crucial, but recovery is a big job, and utilizing SDRs is another tool for rebuilding and strengthening our fiscal position. Of course, it is not free money. The interest rate associated with special drawing right is 0.05%, far below market rates. We have a discretion as an IMF member state to utilize these assets for our national benefit. Today, this amendment ensures that our laws align with our national priorities and needs as a government. And if they look at what the amendment on this issue says, it says, to remove any doubt as to what this is for. And doubt may have been risen because doubt was in his mind. Doubt was in other people's mind as well, until they pressed the button. And once they pressed the button, they understood, well, they now understand. But to ensure that there's no further question on this matter, let's amend the act. So if someone else is around, and to avoid the douse that's been out there, we could clean it up. All right? And the IMF itself, as I said, and as I said, you push the button, you'll see. They support, they know what the intended purpose of this money is for. And the funds are not owned by the central bank. You see, that was part of the issue. It goes to the central bank. Is it owned by the central bank? No, it's not. It's the nation's. And we could use it, yes, we could use it for propping up our reserves. But we could use it to help reduce our debts as well. Help us to pay off other concerns that we have. It is for the purpose of stabilizing and helping us out of the challenges that we face. During the pandemic, global economies had shut down, and these special drawing rights were intended to provide the necessary boost to keep the global economy afloat. Initially, our primary need was to maintain our levels of foreign reserves. It was in August of 2021 that the Central Bank of the Bahamas gained access to the special drawing rights, valued at $247.5 million, and was held as international reserves. The funds served the immediate purpose, but over time, as this administration oversaw the nation's economic recovery, our needs as a government changed. You see, Madam Speaker, when tourism is at an all-time high and the economy is recovering at a record pace, money is coming into the country and foreign reserves can be maintained in a way that was not possible during the pandemic. This is why the role of the special drawing rights in boosting our foreign reserves was so critical when the economy was locked down and you had these curfews. Now that the economic situation has changed, our needs have changed. The bill before us today allows us to adapt the use of these resources to reflect our evolving national priorities and to align with the IMF mandate as to SDRs. In this instance, we are specifically addressing the foreign currency debts. In amending the central bank to allow a government to access it, we are preserving the intended function of these resources, as I said, designated by the IMF, with full anticipation that governments would have access to these funds and able to use them based on the country's specific needs. I know that there are members opposite who have been exhibiting their usual confusion. I'm optimistic, so I'm very hopeful, Madam Speaker, that the member from Marco City and his colleagues will one day choose to access research and expertise and facts before mischaracterizing important matters such as these. Just because it hasn't happened yet doesn't mean it can never happen. That's why I'm repeating the explanation for their benefit, that these resources were always intended to be used by governments to cushion the shocks and aftershocks from the pandemic. Surely he recalls the extensive lockdowns and curfews his country subjected our country to. I remember well that despite all that pain, the country's COVID cases during the reign were no better than regional countries who had less draconian shutdowns. I want to caution the honourable member, too, from this terrible instinct he has to run our country down, to reflexively oppose without thinking. It's irresponsible and it's unnecessary. This should be uncontroversial. One tool among many to fuel our recovery. It's tiresome to see every amendment dragged down by ignorance and the desperation to score political points. I know, they're having their internal strife. And this may cause, it causes tremendous stress. But that should be no excuse for choosing to aggressively misinform the Bahamian people. There are much healthier and more productive ways to address stress, I just exercise. I suggest that too. And I have my own quiet reflection. I do that too, I suggest that too. And perhaps these would, those, well, time will tell, those would be beneficial. Sadly, the rhetoric and tactics coming from the current leader feels strangely familiar. He seems to have taken a page from the playbook of his leader next to him, Kalani. Boy, you smiling, boy, you it. You're smiling this morning, but you had a good weekend. I want to see the gorilla, man. When I can see the gorilla. When you go bring the gorilla out, man. When you put this gorilla on me, man. I want to see this gorilla. He could never miss an opportunity, Kalani, right, to paint a negative picture of our nation, particularly on the international stage. When it comes to the IMF special drawing rights, what is so nonsensical about the oppositions is that the IMF, and I can repeat this, clearly supports the use of funds for debt purposes, and so does the central bank. Central Bank of the Bahamas has gone on record to state that they are cooperating with the government on this amendment, and we gave it to you. I urge the member for Marco City to refrain from questioning a policy in any way that calls into question the objectivity and expertise of this crucial institution. Some things should just never be politicized. Based on the commentary from the members opposite, you would think that what we are doing is unheard of. The previous comments make it out to be some unprecedented exercise of government authority, when in fact, what we are doing is quite common. Within the past 2 years, Madam Speaker, I give this background. Within the past 2 years, 98 countries have used special drawing rights in response to the economic downturn associated with the pandemic. Of these 98 countries, 55 have used special drawing rights for IMF debt relief, and 69 have used these resources for fiscal purposes. 69 countries have done this, Madam Speaker. There's no controversy here. That's a government doing what governments are supposed to do, taking advantage of an important resource. I'm confident that we have acted in the best interest of the Bahamian people and the fiscal health of this nation. I fully support the central bank amendment as an important step toward the strategic use of IMF drawing rights to improve the fiscal health of our nation. And as pointed out, Madam Speaker, the additional amendment that we're doing, we are ensuring that the monetary authority to which we can borrow funds, right, but we want to make it statutory clear that there's only so much we should be able to borrow from the authority. And we're reducing that to 15.5% of the available assets that to which we could borrow up to that from the central bank. And we thought that since this issue of borrowing from the central bank was raised by the side offices, we would show them how we'll do it one time. We thought we'd just add this amendment in. We reviewed it, and in collaboration with the governor of the central bank, we deemed that 15.5% is a workable and livable solution, and it keeps any government responsible in respect to ensuring that we maintain our debt sustainability going forward. And so, Madam Speaker, I so move that for the second reading and passing of the Central Bank of the Bahamas Amendment Bill that deals with the SDRs, and just to point out again, it starts up for the avoidance of doubt. And that is why this bill is being passed, just to ensure that no doubt could arise as to what the SDRs could be used for, and to align it with what the mandate of the IMF is sets out. And as I said, let's move from if we become lame brain, don't let our fingers become lame just as well. Because just pushing a button to give the answers to some of your questions. What is it? Google it? Google it. Google it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Is there a seconder? The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Centerville.
Good morning, Madam Speaker.
Good morning, Honorable Member.
Madam Speaker, I rise again in this honorable place on behalf of the beautiful people of the great constituency of Centerville. And I do this, Madam Speaker, on the strength of the Almighty God, who has sought fit to allow us all to see this new day. Madam Speaker, life is a very precious thing. And sometimes we can take it for granted, as it seems so automatic that we just go to sleep and wake up and go to sleep and wake up. But I'd like to take this opportunity to extend condolences to all of the persons in my community and across the nation, Madam Speaker, whose relatives have not been so fortunate and who have not made it to today's day. In particular, Madam Speaker, I'd like to pay specific attention to the family of one Charles Goatskin Miller, who was recently funeralized this weekend, Madam Speaker. He was an integral part of the Junkanoo community and a strong pillar of strength in the Fowler Street community, Madam Speaker. And as always, may their souls rest in peace and rise again in glory. Madam Speaker, with that being said, on a much lighter note, I missed out on the festivities in the Exuma Isles this weekend, Madam Speaker. I saw some of my colleagues practicing their sculling skills and sailing skills, Madam Speaker, but the Honorable Member for West End told me not to fare, and that my decision to stay here to celebrate the 102nd birthday of my grandmother, Sybil Archer, was a much wiser choice. Madam Speaker, we had a good old-fashioned family backyard birthday party. We were supported by some of my Dalton brothers, Phil Tynes, Lenny Smith, Vaughn Jones, and Shane Bunker. And we just celebrated time with family and friends. He missed it.
Sanders missed it.
He missed it. And so, Madam Speaker, I'd just like to take this opportunity again to wish her a happy belated birthday. Madam Speaker, I also rise to lend my support to the bill before us today for debate, the Central Bank of the Bahamas Amendment Bill 2023. Now, the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the member for Cat Island, Rumkey, and San Salvador, has ably made the case for the passage of this bill. I honestly can't say that there's much left for me to do, and my contribution will simply bolster what the Honorable Member has already outlined in his presentation. Madam Speaker, I believe that one of the indicators of good governance is the results gained from the efforts of any administration to handle the fiscal affairs of the country. This task is of such great consequence to the people of the Bahamas, their lives, and their livelihoods. The government must be able to set an atmosphere of prosperity and growth at any given time, and must also be able to competently contend with any economic headwinds and downturns in a manner that will not adversely affect future turnaround. This indeed is a great responsibility among the many other responsibilities that the government has to handle. How the economy of the Bahamas helps or harms the average Bahamian today and in future generations should weigh heavy on the minds of those of us with the power to make such decisions on their behalf. The Progressive Liberal Party has a stellar record of economic prudence and success while in government. PLP administrations over the years have widened the economy to include those who were marginalized, those who were relegated to certain jobs and careers. The efforts of PLP administrations have resulted in a budget surplus, low unemployment numbers, and declining budget deficits through good stewardship. It is undeniable that time after time, the PLP has performed ably in the administration of the financial affairs of this country and in the best interests of its people. Now, to be equitable, I am sure that those on the opposite side can find at least one thing to boast about in this regard as well. Madam Speaker, from time to time, the acts of Parliament which govern our country must be reviewed and revised in order to be brought in line with updated practices and processes or to effect needed corrections. This bill falls into that category of what I call cleanup bills, where it is required of the members of this place to change what already exists. The act that we are seeking to modify is relatively new, having been debated and passed just in 2020 by the previous administration. Our concentration, however, is on Section 17A, 21, 22, and 22A. Madam Speaker, as it relates to Section 17 of the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act, This covers the administration of the foreign reserves of the country. Foreign reserves are the amount of assets that the Bahamas has in currencies of other countries. The proposed amendments are being made to address the handling of special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund. In August 2021, the IMF made $456 billion, or the equivalent of $650 billion available to countries around the world in an effort to combat the negative impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. At the time the SDR facility was made available, the IMF Managing Director, Ms. Georgieva, released a statement saying, the SDR allocation will provide additional liquidity to the global economic system, supplementing countries' foreign exchange reserves and reducing their reliance on more expensive domestic or external debt. Countries can use the space provided by the SDR allocation to support their economies and step up their fight against the crisis, end quote. The Bahamas received 174.8 million SDR, or 247 million, to the international reserves of the central bank. At the time, in a release, the central bank said its intention was, and I quote, to use the SDR allocations for foreign reserve management operations, in particular, holding them available for any increase in foreign exchange needs expressed through the private and public sectors. Madam Speaker, this bill adds Section 17A to the current act. This section, among other things, gives the minister in charge of this act the authority to access these special drawing rights and details how they can be used if accessed. Section 17A1 says, for the avoidance of doubt, notwithstanding any other provision of this act or any other written law, and subject to subsection 2, the minister shall be entitled to access, utilize, or convert special drawing rights allocated by the IMF and apply the proceeds of such conversion, A, to reduce the government's foreign debt obligations, B, to manage the government's foreign currency debt operations. 2, the minister's access, use, or conversion of any special drawing rights shall be A, consistent with any permitted use of special drawing rights set out in guidance notes or policies published by the IMF. B, upon such terms and conditions as may be agreed between the minister and the bank, subject to the provisions of the Act. Section 3. Section 21 shall not apply to A, the use or conversion of special drawing rights, B, the proceeds from such conversion. Madam Speaker, the granting of access for the government to use these SDRs in the ways prescribed by this amendment will give added options to the government in financing the needs of the country. As the new section states, the minister must adhere to the guidance notes provided by the IMF in utilizing the SDR. Section 3 of the introduction of the IMF's guidance note for fund staff on the treatment and use of SDR allocations states in part, members enjoy a large degree of freedom in how to manage the SDRs allocated to them, including to what extent central banks are involved in their management and whether the budget can directly use them for budget support. Section 14 of the same document, under the heading General Macroeconomic Implications and Policy Advice, states, member countries can use their SDRs unconditionally. Members do not have to meet any requirements to receive their share of SDRs in a general allocation. And they have the right to use SDRs in transactions, i.e. to exchange their SDRs to obtain freely usable currencies or in operations authorized by the fund, including payments of financial obligations, loans, pledges, donations, swaps, and forward transactions. The addition of this section presupposes that any minister accessing these SDRs would do so on the advice of all relevant government agencies and stakeholders, with a clear understanding of the risks and rewards of the intended action and use. The deletion of Section 21, subsection 4 in the current Act, with what is proposed in the bill, reduces the amount of loans that the government can have outstanding at any time to 15.5% of government ordinary revenue. This is a reduction of nearly half from the current Act, as indicated earlier by the Honorable Member. The current Act in Section 21.4 says, the amount of the loans which may be outstanding at any one time, taken together with any Treasury bill or securities issued or guaranteed by the government or public corporation, shall not exceed an aggregate 30% of the average ordinary revenue of the government, or 30% of the estimated ordinary revenue of the government, whichever is the lesser amount. Madam Speaker, the amendment bill before us in Section 21 of the Principal Act is amended in subsection 4 by the deletion of paragraph 8 and the substitution of the following. 8, the amount of the loans which may be outstanding at any one time shall not exceed in the aggregate 15.5% of the average ordinary review of the government, or 15.5% of the estimated ordinary revenue of the government, whichever is the less. Now, Madam Speaker, I confess that I'm not an economist or financial analyst, but it would seem to me that this is an improvement on the current Act. This calls for those in charge of the administration of the finances of our country to do so with the utmost forethought and prudence in order to remain within the parameters of this law, understanding the limit of borrowing available. That being the case, the move to amend this Act would be in the best interests of this country and in the best interests of the Bahamian people. Madam Speaker, the repeal of Section 22 of the current Act and the substitution of what is proposed in this bill will prohibit the central bank from the purchase or subscription from the primary markets, treasury bills, and securities issued or guaranteed by the government or any public corporation. Primary markets are basically where new securities are issued for trading. The insertion of the new Section 22A, subsection 1 and 2, outlines how and under what circumstances the central bank may, for the purpose of implementing monetary policy, maintaining financial system stability, or to support the working of the clearing and settlement systems, purchase from the secondary markets, treasury bills, and securities listed or guaranteed by the government or a public corporation if the treasury bills and securities are negotiable. The use of secondary markets instead of primary markets in this instance provides an added security and less risk to central bank procedure. And this again is in the best interests of the Bahamas and the Bahamian people. Madam Speaker, it is understood and accepted that successive administrations would have differences in opinion on how to handle business and how business should be conducted while in government. The amending of the current Central Bank of the Bahamas Act passed and enacted by the former administration demonstrates such differences in opinion. It is my view that these amendments strengthen the current act while providing the government with access to financial instruments meant to be used for the benefit of this country and its citizens as we recover from the prolonged pandemic and the accompanying economic downturn. Thankfully, Madam Speaker, we are now seeing the turnaround in numbers in our number one industry, and other indicators of recovery continue to illuminate. This is a trend that I pray continues. Madam Speaker, with these words, I support this bill and ask colleagues to follow suit. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you, Honorable Member. It has been moved and seconded that the following bill be read a second time and committed. A bill for an act to amend the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act. As many? The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Marco City.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Once again, I'd like to thank Almighty God and the people of Marco City for giving me an opportunity once again to make my voice available to stand in their defense and also to help them realize their dreams and aspirations, Madam Speaker. Today, we are looking, Madam Speaker, at the amendment to the Central Bank Act. Madam Speaker, we would not be here today debating this amendment had it not been for the fact that the Prime Minister and his colleagues made a decision to draw down on $232 million, to be a little bit more precise, $232.8 million of special drawing rights, even though they had no lawful authority, Madam Speaker, to do so. The Davis administration, Madam Speaker, is engaging in a pattern of behavior that is potentially detrimental to the long-term financial management of our national economy. This is evident, Madam Speaker, as I would come to in several respects. We are having this debate today because they have once again, Madam Speaker, broken the law. And once again, they are seeking to not only cover up their misappropriation of public funds, but they are trying to make their illegal acts legal today. They are, furthermore, trying to get the opposition to become complicit in their wrongdoing and subsequent attempt to exonerate themselves. Madam Speaker, there's a simple definition in Bahamian law as it relates to what is considered misappropriation of funds. Among the definition is the one that says committing government to a debt, to a liability that is not supported by the law. Madam Speaker, the very fact that we are here today is the government's own admission. In fact, the memorandum of understanding tabled by the Prime Minister himself is Exhibit A of his participation in his capacity as Minister of Finance in an illegal act. He is seeking to amend a law to allow him to do what the government has already done, drawn down on $232.8 million. That is why the document before you, the amendment, says that it is retroactive to the period where the illegal act was carried out, drawing down on $232.8 million. So when the Prime Minister seeks to be cute and disparaging by talking about pressing a button, the reality is that the Prime Minister knows very well that what was done was improper. Hence, for the last several months, Madam Speaker, your team has gotten notice that we would debate this amendment. And each time we came closer to debating this amendment, the government changed its mind, deferred it, and adjusted the amendment it first provided to the House. They knew that something was afoul. Let me amend that. The House members knew something was afoul. The Prime Minister knew from the very beginning, which is precisely why the very memorandum of understanding that you have in front of you lays out the case that this government was not authorized to draw down and utilize the special drawing rights. Madam Speaker, I wrote the Prime Minister, and let me just say, just for the record, Madam Speaker, during the course of this brief presentation, I intend to refer to the very guidance notes that the Prime Minister mentioned, which I'm confident he did not read in its entirety. Secondly, Madam Speaker, let me amend that to say he did not read the sections relative to this liability. In addition, Madam Speaker, I will refer to the very memorandum of understanding that the Prime Minister laid before us. I wrote the Prime Minister, Madam Speaker, and the Governor of the Central Bank the end of last year. In fact, the end of December. The Governor, Madam Speaker, and the Prime Minister responded. The Prime Minister said then some of what he is saying now, that this is not, I repeat, that this is not a loan. In other words, this is not a liability. Well, Madam Speaker, that is patently untrue, and the Prime Minister knows it. So I'd like to take you through, Madam Speaker, several pieces of legislation and documents made available to us. I want to use the Prime Minister's documents. Issued pursuant to the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act 2020. For value received, the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas hereby promises to pay to the Central Bank of the Bahamas special drawing rights, SDRs, $178.4 million by December 1st, 2023. Let me repeat. The government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas hereby promises to pay to the Central Bank of the Bahamas special drawing rights, SDRs, $178.4 million by December 1st, 2023, together with interest at the SDR rates as determined by the IMF. As notified by the central bank, interest shall be payable at such frequency and on such dates as may be set by the IMF. This sounds eerily like a liability. No, I didn't say loan, but people would easily use the terms interchangeably. It's a liability. Let me continue. All or any part of the sum of STR 178.4 million shall be paid by credit of the amount to either BSD, Bahamian dollar, or BSD account, and long number, on the account, long number, of the Central Bank of the Bahamas. If payment of part of the said sum shall be made, a new note is substantially the same form of this note for the sum remaining unpaid hereon. Let me just simplify it. The bottom line is the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, through the central bank, Madam Speaker, sought to take possession of funds it needed for whatever purposes. The funds, Madam Speaker, were a part of the assets of the central bank, contrary to what the Prime Minister says. What he says doesn't matter. It's what the document said. Therefore, the Prime Minister and his colleagues through the Ministry of Finance had to enter into a formal arrangement with the central bank to take possession of funds that were a part of the central bank's asset. Madam Speaker, that is precisely why when the central bank released its report, that we discovered, Madam Speaker, that there was a liability that this government had incurred to the central bank for funds they had taken possession of. Now, here's what's interesting about that. One, the government in July released its debt management plan and strategy. It never indicated any intention to borrow or add a liability in terms of funds it would take from the central bank. So this was a complete surprise to the population. This is the government that talks about transparency. How do you not indicate that you are about to draw down on 232.8 million special drawing rights, which translate into the 178 million? How do you not tell the population you have intentions to draw down on this fund? You just release a report indicating your liabilities, your intended liabilities, the debts you would incur. Why did you not indicate this particular thing? It's clear it's not free money. I just read the government's document that makes the point clearly that it is not free money. So if you want to get cute, I would use a different word, but like the Prime Minister, I wish to be kind. I would suggest that the Prime Minister knows full well that what has been done is that the Prime Minister has gotten a loan, but let's park that for a moment. He has incurred a liability with the central bank. The central bank, by going to the market and converting the SDRs into cash, has incurred a liability, and the central bank must pay back, and the government must then pay the central bank. So what the reality is, to make it simple and plain, is that the government of the Bahamas has incurred a debt from member countries of the IMF, a debt that must be repaid. So there's no free money here. The Prime Minister, in being cute, didn't mention one detail about any of those papers he held up. Not one. No details. He just listed them. So we're reading people. The Prime Minister has entered into an arrangement. So again, did not forecast it in the debt management strategy, and never indicated the purpose for which the monies would be used. Imagine that. $178 million, never indicate what the purpose is. And what makes it alarming to us is this is the same administration that was painting the rosy picture that all is well, that the economy blinging, it running, it clicking on all cylinders. We are ahead of revenue projections, things Gucci, things going well. But yet, we are drawing down on these reserves that are a part of the assets of the central bank. So, Madam Speaker, for all of the bluster of the Prime Minister, the reality is his own document. Let me read it for members of the public. It says, Memorandum of Understanding between the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of the Bahamas regarding the respective responsibilities, listen to this, respective responsibilities of the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of the Bahamas in connection with the use of the 2021 special drawing rights allocation by the International Monetary Fund. This is the document. And if you go in this document, Madam Speaker, on page 2, look at item F to the bottom of page 2. Here's what it says. Based on the advice of its external legal counsel, the bank is of the view that, one, using the 2021 SDR allocation for the purpose would create a liability from the government to the bank, notwithstanding Section 4.6 of the Act. And two, a position could be taken, as it has been, that the government would have exceeded the authorized borrowing limit set forth in Section 21 of the Central Bank of the Bahamas Act 2020, the Central Bank Act. The reality is, the legal counsel had a concern and expressed it. In fact, we believe that the central bank officials were reluctant to enter into this agreement, because you would recall that they are on record having said previously to the Minister administration that you could not use these allocations for whatever the purposes the government is now using for. We don't know. The government refuses to tell us. And the Minister administration paid attention to the short-term lending time that was required, 91 days. This government has a loan, or they said it's not a loan. They have a liability that is for a year. So not only do they exceed the ceiling, they exceed the timeline consistent with the use of SDRs. I'm sure the Prime Minister knows better. Let me continue. In the same document, Article 3, servicing of the obligations to the IMF. Yeah, this servicing, any of you have had loans? Plenty struggling Bahamians had loans. We know we have to service the loans. But the Prime Minister says that this is free money. Servicing of the obligation to the IMF that relate to the use of the 2021 SDR allocation shall be fulfilled without a financial burden to the bank. Payments of all costs and charges related to the use and reconstitution of the SDR allocation, including payment of interest charges as determined by the IMF, are the responsibility of the ministry. 2, the interest rate payments to the IMF will be made by the bank on behalf of the government in accordance with the procedures of the IMF. 3, the bank and the ministry will agree the schedule for the government's 1, payment of the cost, charges, and interest rates for its use of the SDR allocation. That sounds like free money. Reconstitution of the SDR allocation. That sounds like free money. And B, the schedule for reconstitution shall be no later than the maturity schedule for the government's US dollar liabilities. If this was free money, they'd get a piece of paper and say that one over. Didn't happen. All the signatures on the back. Signatures include the Prime Minister and the Governor of the Central Bank. Madam Speaker, it gets worse. It gets worse. Madam Speaker, this government drew down on the money in 2 tranches and did so again before the law permitted them to do so. Imagine that. You know how many young Bahamians, middle-aged and older Bahamians are before the courts being accused of moving things that they had no lawful right for. You may have a need, but obviously this government even denied that it had a need. But people are before the courts. But this administration refused, Madam Speaker, to do what it could have. The government could have simply come here, amended the law, and then proceed with their folly, with what they intended to do. But instead, because this administration is not transparent, no respect for law, they are prepared to make these bold decisions, as they did in taking a loan in the Department of Housing, in the Ministry of Housing, claiming to be a corporate soul, knowing full well the Housing Act does not give them the authority to do so. In the same way, they went to the Treasury and took funds to go to Bermuda and then say, man, that's like zero because we can pay it back. How many people are locked down in Fox Hill for no? I mean, it's just absolutely incredible because they moved something. They didn't have the luxury. They didn't have the protection of Parliament and executive privilege to say we can take care of that later. This government is prepared to break the law and then come here with bluster and insults because we simply raise a question which is our duty. Madam Speaker, so calculating are the actions of this administration that you would recall, Madam Speaker, that we just amended the Public Financial Management Act. And we kept raising the question. The member for East Grand Baham and myself stayed on this issue. Why did you amend the previous act to remove section 5.4 that reads, a public officer or public office holder shall not expend public money, create debt, enter into any commitments or otherwise create liabilities for the government without lawful authority. Do you think for a moment, Madam Speaker, they anticipated that if that was to remain in the bill they were about to pass, that there could be some culpability, some responsibility for those that violated the Central Bank Act, and that maybe they wanted to hold off until they have come to do this thing, to retroactively fix an illegal act that they carried out, because that's what they're doing. But we will not be complicit with that. You can't break the law, come here. You can't be, to borrow a phrase, you can't be strong and wrong simultaneously. Us Bahamians say at the same time. It's inappropriate. So, Madam Speaker, we are deeply concerned that there's one law for the Progressive Liberal Party, the Davis-led administration, and then there's a different law for the rest of Bahamians. Madam Speaker, if you look at the Central Bank Act, it says some very interesting things. I want to go for a moment, Madam Speaker, to page 16 of the Act. Advances to the government. It reads 21(1). Subject to the provisions of this section, the bank shall not make any direct or indirect advances to the government or to any public corporation. Now, if you hold in some money for somebody, whenever you're ready to get your money, that's your things. You call them and they free up. They make available, the funds to you. Contrary to the claims of the member for Cat Island, this was not free money just parked there that whenever he or his colleagues decide, they could go and get it. If that was the case, everything I just read would not have been necessary. And so, again, the Minister administration complied with that provision. This administration, not a day like it. They're above the law. Everybody else would be beaten over their head with the law, but not this administration. Madam Speaker, let me go back to the guidance notes just for a moment. Madam Speaker, guidance notes, the Prime Minister pulled frequently asked questions. So obviously when he pressed that button, he didn't have time to read all the other stuff. He just focused on the frequently asked questions. We do that from time to time. But there's a broader, thicker document that has more information. And point 5 in that document says the following. I'm just going to read 2 sentences into your hearing today, Pastor. 5 says, at the same time, the SDR allocation entails risk that need to be considered and managed. Recipient countries could delay needed macroeconomic adjustment and reforms or use SDRs without fully considering the potential costs and risk. Second sentence, these include, among others, the quarterly interest charges at variable interest rates associated with the use of SDRs and the need to monitor closely SDR holdings to ensure timely settlement of SDR-denominated obligations to the fund. Obligations, free money. Well, in this case, this makes it very clear. The government has taken on a liability by taking possession of what was a part of the central bank's asset. And when the central bank, in agreement with the government, went to the international market to convert those SDRs to cash, they incurred a liability, which they must repay. But the cost ain't gonna stay with them, it's gonna go to the borrower. the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. It is a liability. Take the word loan, throw it out of the window if you like. But it is a liability that this administration, and by extension us as a people, have to fulfill. And the question is, in having to pay this back in a year, if you couldn't pay, if you didn't have the money last year, what is occurring in the economy that's going to empower you within the 12-month period to pay now? We suspect that it's going to be rolled over as frequently as the Prime Minister is able to get assistance in executing that. And so, Madam Speaker, I wish to read another part of the guidance notes into your hearing. Number 27, a member's decision on the on-lending, that is, from you to another, arrangements should be informed by financial autonomy considerations for central bank. Again, there's a degree of independence that the central bank has, right? These include whether the on-lending balances fall in the statutory limits or prohibitions or credit to government. And I talked about that earlier. That while the SDRs are made available to member countries, the SDRs, the use of them, the accessing of them, it's all subjected to the laws of the country. And that's why the member for East Grand Bahama constantly talked about the Debt Management Act. And so at the 27.1,
The actual guidance notes.
they're not the frequently asked questions. The accounting, the second part of number 27 says, the accounting consequences that follow from the terms and conditions of such on-lending based on central bank's financial reporting framework. That's okay. But I tell you, Madam Speaker, why is this important? This is important, Madam Speaker, because investors who are listening to our Prime Minister, rating agencies who are listening to our Prime Minister, the credit market that's listening to the Prime Minister, they must be concerned today that the Prime Minister's representation of these facts are inaccurate, and he is at the helm. He is at the helm. He is responsible. And so, Madam Speaker, when your members say nobody understands, the people who can impact our economy clearly understand that the facts have been misrepresented by the member for Cat Island, Rum Key, and San Salvador, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, as I wrap up, Madam Speaker, I go back to the original document. What the Prime Minister has said today on his feet is what he has said in the letter that he wrote to me, what he has said in the public domain, Madam Speaker. It is nothing short of misleading the public. Even if he doesn't want to use a word loan, that's fine. It is a liability that he has incurred. Why did he not, in his earlier contribution to the debt management bill, why did he not tell us that he was going to take possession of this fund? The only time this government addressed the $232.8 million in special drawing rights is when we raised it. Before that, it was of no moment. Before that, they didn't get in a discussion in the public domain about having to come here today to clean up what they did back then. Let's just think about it. Even though you're on side, just think about this for a moment. Why is there a necessity for it to be retroactive if nothing wrong was done? It is to correct the misappropriation of funds. But they are not strangers. They are not strangers to that, Madam Speaker. They did it in going to Bermuda. No consequences. Everybody else has to face consequences, but not this crew. Worse. Madam Speaker, let me just highlight as I take my seat the pattern of behavior, because this is not a one-off. There's a pattern of behavior by this administration. During both the 22nd of February debate on the fiscal responsibility report and the midterm budget, we asserted that this government had a liability, and they denied all the way through, much like the member for Fort Charlotte did with BPL. In one clip, we have 10 minutes and 11 seconds, told an untruth 8 times. Just most unfortunate. And then only admitted later. And then implicated the member, forget Island, Rumkins, and Salvador. In other words, we did this together, you know. But by the way, he made the decision. It was him, you know. The member ran from that. The member said, no, it wasn't me. It was he said the ministry. The tape said, he said the minister. But here was the takeaway from the midterm budget. This administration, violation of the Procurement Act, their position is simply, we can change the law. So us violating it all the way through is irrelevant because at some point in the future, we can change it. That's what this is. We will take the money and later on we can come back to make the legislation say that everything was fine in terms of what we did. That's what we're doing here. Read the amendment. They violated the procurement law, the Procurement Act. They violated the Central Bank Act. They violated the Debt Management Act, violated the Housing Act. That's why the member left. They violated Road Traffic Act, Madam Speaker, and they violated the Public Financial Management Act. So, Madam Speaker, as I take my seat, I just ask for just a minute or two, Madam Speaker, to just make the point that this is a country of laws. And this administration should behave in a consistent manner as opposed to projecting the image that they are the paragon of virtue. And yet, we bring clear evidence that they are consistently violating the laws of the Bahamas and have no remorse, no shame, and I fear no intention to change in the future. Marco City, and by extension, members of our team do not support this amendment.
Thank you, Honorable Member Asmini. The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Foxhill.
So, Madam Speaker, not to put too fine a point on it then, when the monies which are the result of this amendment come to be spent, the people of Marco City are not to be the beneficiaries of these funds, I suggest, since the opposition doesn't support it. I guess that's what it means. I'm only thinking on my feet, you know. So there's that, and this is money to keep the country going and to make sure that the public servants get paid and to make sure that the Ministry of Education has the funds and to make sure those people in Inagua get the buildings they need and the roads to be fixed. And the leader of the opposition says, I don't support it. Very good, very good. For the record, no law has been broken. No policy has been violated. You can preach doom and gloom all you wish. I suppose that's the modus operandi of the side opposite. But at the end of the day, the country is going to progress. The monies will be properly allocated for the funds which are approved by Parliament, and life will go on. The central bank is put in this position, I think, because in the days of Hubert Ingram's administration, the Central Bank Act was changed to give it autonomy. And autonomy is a very interesting thing because for a country to survive, Madam Speaker, I always thought that there ought to be synergy between fiscal policy, that is, that conducted out of the Ministry of Finance, and policies from the central bank, which deals with monetary policy. And although the Ministry of Finance does not control the central bank, you'd want those two agencies to be working together for the forward progress of the country. Now, as I understand it, the way things are now constructed, the central bank is autonomous from the Ministry of Finance and from the actions of the Minister of Finance and from the government itself entirely. And the closest you get to influencing policies of the central bank is, of course, by your appointment to the members of the board. But it seems to me that a central banker ought to always be looking at ensuring that there's this synergy between fiscal and monetary policy. It may be, therefore, that some future government might have to look again at the way the entire act is structured so that there is a continuation of this synergy between the two. I don't think we've reached that point yet. But what I would really like to address and why I asked for permission to speak here this morning is because the central bank also has another role, and that role, in addition to the monetary policy, and by monetary policy it means maintaining the value of the Bahamian dollar. And in sum, the value of the Bahamian dollar is maintained. It's a derived value. It's derived by the amount of US dollars which the central bank has in its reserves. And so every Bahamian government tries to make sure that there are as many US dollars in the reserves as possible. I think the last I heard it was 2 billion or somewhere around there. And each Bahamian dollar in the economy is supported by 1 US dollar sitting in the central bank. And that's the way we were able to get goods and services from overseas. So that's their role. Their main role is maintaining that dollar. But there is another role which they have, and that is the role of regulating the banking sector. And that's the issue which I would like to raise today. I can tell you that my constituents are agitated to no end about the regulation or the lack thereof of regulation of the banking sector in this country. That we have, over the past decade, presided over the debanking of communities from north to south in the country. We have presided over the depersonalization of services in the banking sector. We have presided over the increase in costs of services and the lessening of those services. We have complained and screamed and shouted and done whatever we can to reverse this trend. We've appealed to the regulator, and nothing has changed that path or that pattern. And so the relevance of my debate today is to do what I can in terms of my voice to make a public appeal with regard to this. I've spoken to the governor of the central bank. I know the angst and the pain in the communities like North Andros, where there's no bank. And where else? Andros. Where else? Long Island. Crooked Island, of course, has never had one. But I always thought, certainly during Lyndon Pindling's time, that there was a bargain made with the banks. You make money in New Providence, hand over fist. And in exchange, you put banks in these rural communities so that these people can have access to banking services. But that social contract seems to have collapsed. And it appears that the central bank, who is the regulator, is unable to reverse that trend. The question is, what do we do? Several Bahamians have tried to get banking licenses themselves. And they can't even get banking licenses from the central bank. Well, we've had a year and a half at it, so. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. But I started off, no, we started off. We started off by, no, we started off by saying, we started off by saying, they passed a law which gave autonomy to the central bank. So the PLP had nothing to do with whether the license was obtained or not. You know? It got nothing to do with control. It's about sensible public policy. Sensible public policy. That's what this is about. You know? And then, you know, every day you wake up, I actually don't know what to do now if somebody writes me a check. What do I do with it? Can I actually go in the bank and deposit it? I might contribute it to your election account. Yeah. It would be a modest contribution, I assure you. Yeah. But anything to stop menace. Anything to stop menace. So the lady, because, and I start with checks because I'm sorry to use this expression, Madam Speaker, but I consider it really a fool's errand to be hiring a consultant for 2 years, as I understand it, to convince us why we shouldn't be writing checks. Because I gather the next thing on the chopping block is checks. We are supposed to stop writing checks. Now, the technology exists right now in the United States. My sister showed me how to do it, how she does it. You get a check, you take the phone, take a picture, goes to your bank, instant money into your account, no issue. Or you walk up to the ATM, put the check through the thing, instant money into your account. So why would we be talking about we can stop writing checks, or we going to ban the writing of checks? And then to hire a consultant to do that over 2 years, to teach us why we shouldn't be writing checks. Doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense to me. And what is it? It costs now, you put money into it, you know, you give somebody a check now, they try and put it in their account, it costs $10 for you to put your own money in the bank. And the services just seem to deteriorate. The one that really annoys Bahamians is when you dial on the phone, you can't get anybody in the bank to answer the phone.
No, from the Bahamas to
That's right, the phone is being answered by someone somewhere else. And you say, someone must be able to deal with this as an issue because people are just getting annoyed about it. So one of the solutions to this problem might be that the legislature is going to have to intervene. There's a man named Charles Fox of now blessed memory who in the early 70s had a consumer protection association. And in this country, the NGOs have more or less disappeared that used to exist in the post-independence period. But one of the aspects of the work of that organization was to advocate for consumer protection. And I'm wondering now whether the answer to this is not to separate the regulatory functions from the monetary functions of the bank and doing some things like ensuring that there is Bahamian content in banking so that when a customer of a bank needs to find out something from the bank, that they have a right to speak to someone in person. Not someone on the phone, but someone in person. And they have a right to speak to someone in person in the Bahamas. Maybe that's something that can be supplied by statute. Don't know. And then maybe one has to look at capping the charges that can be brought for services being advanced by what is, after all, a public good. Maybe. Maybe the legislature can indicate that by statute. But what would be preferable, I think, is if the banking sector and the central bank got the message. And if the opposition, I don't know if anybody else plans to speak, would simply say, I heard you say from your seat that you agree with some of what I said. Great, I love it. Yes, let's hold hands and sing together Kumbaya on this. And I think maybe that would be a useful thing to do. But I just want to mark again, Madam Speaker, that this, as far as I'm concerned, is a really serious problem. And I would wish that some solutions are coming quickly. I know that some entrepreneurs are now working with certain of the banks and with the government with the idea of creating banking agencies, which is a new form of financial services where the banks themselves have representatives in various islands. But if we can move to that way, I think that's done in the Dominican Republic. I think if we can do that, that might rectify some of the issues of these communities that are being debanked or have been debanked, and provide the liquidity which is necessary for communities to be able to survive on a daily basis. So that's the main thing I wanted to raise here today. I am a fierce consumer advocate in this matter, that these communities need these services, and that Bahamians ought to be respected in their own country by these institutions that have made a fortune in this country. And there's nothing, in my view, which justifies the charges, the level of charges that are being imposed upon Bahamian consumers for B-dollar banking in this country. And I'm hoping that as time goes on, that there is someone who actually listens in the regulatory bodies to dealing with these matters. We can argue the esoteric points about deficits and whether we had the right to draw down on the special drawing rights, but it was Hilary Beckles who made the point when he argues on the point of reparations. And you know, we're always being lectured, all of our societies across the region are being lectured about how we have these huge debts and the debts are unsustainable and we should really be more responsible. You know, poor Jamaica has been in the IMF's hands about 2 or 3 times since independence. The last time was the housing bubble, which took place, I guess, that was in and around 2008. And you know, Jamaica had then something like 2.4 billion US in their reserves. P.J. Patterson may have been the prime minister at the time. And he told me that, you know, there was this housing bubble, housing market collapse, largely because of speculation in the private sector. But what was the government to do? And he said they were betwixt and between as to what to do. But he said he's coming out of his party's convention. And as he's walking out of the convention, one of his big supporters from one of the rural parishes in Jamaica walked up to him and said, "Prime, I don't want to hear anything. I want my money. I want my money." He said he got his marching orders. So the government of Jamaica had to step in, created FinSAC, and they essentially bought up all the bad debt. The result was the collapse of their reserves and back into the hands of the IMF. Before that, as I was saying, Hilary Beckles makes the point that, when the British handed off independence to our countries, they gave the impression that they just seamlessly handed these wonderfully run countries to us with no debt and everything was going so smoothly. Except in some of our countries, Jamaica, again, the obvious example where the literacy rate or the literacy rate was something like 10, 12, 15%. Most people in Jamaica couldn't read at independence. So the government had to spend money on education. And what do you do to develop a country? If you ain't got the money in the treasury, you got to borrow it. So that's why I say philosophically with our countries, we can get as sanctimonious as we want about debt and bow down to all of this stuff. But this country has a problem with poverty right now. The Central Bank of the Bahamas did a survey in December of 2018, and it said of people who are making $30,000 a year or less in this country, 50% of them could not make ends meet at the end of the month. 50%. And how were they making it? They were making it by borrowing from family or friends or working some side job, but that's how they are able to get by. And all of us as members of parliament know the calls which we get from people. I have no food to eat. I'm being put out of my house. I can't, the house is being taken away from me. I had a relative who was telling me that her foreign employer in this country told her that they would not allow anybody in their employ in this country to be paid less than $500 a week because they didn't see how anyone making less than that could actually make it in this country on a weekly basis. And we see it in my constituency where people have to go to the market, not weekly, but you go daily and you buy $20 here, $10 there. That's how people are making it. And when the dead die, you can't bury the dead because you don't have the funds to do it. When you fall ill, God help you, because you don't have the funds to buy the medication. So there's poverty, extreme poverty, which we have to deal with. The only way, in my view, to deal with this is development. And how do you develop? You've got to build things. You have to expand. And we know that almost 50% of the national debt of this country is due to weather-related functions. Not all these things about people keep throwing about corruption and mismanagement and all of these things. They're structural. The fact that we are a small island developing state and we have to face bad weather difficulties and we have to spend a fortune to catch up. And because we have a GDP per capita, which is where it's in the 30s, $33,000 or $34,000 a year per person, we can't qualify for the concessionary loans to fix the problems. So there are a lot of structural issues which cause us to be where we are. And that's why I caution even my own colleagues, this holy grail about deficits and all the rest of it. The expression, the grass is getting greener, but the cow is starving. That's the issue we face. Right now, people have to survive. And we have to put in place a set of policies. You do not agree with us, obviously, because you're on the opposition side. But the country's been not served well by 5 years here and 5 years there and 5 years here and 5 years there, because there's been no sustainable policy. As soon as you come in, you revoke everything we do. And then as soon as we come in, then we say, well, that wasn't the way it should have gone. So what we need, in my view, and I'm arguing again on my feet, is we need a period of stability, which means that the people of the country are going to be asked to support us again, to provide that stability for the country.
The only way.
And there will be, Madam Speaker, there'll be hiccups and there'll be unforced errors. Of course there will be. But what the people of the country will know is that we are dedicated to the national development. We're dedicated to consultation with those who are our opponents, because we believe that there ought to be, as far as possible, consensus building in the way the country develops and goes forward. So that's the way to properly operate this country. So I don't want people to get the impression, I mean, I was sitting here, and I always think doom and gloom, preaching doom and gloom. Let's not preach doom and gloom, because everything we know about the way the country has developed from the past is that whatever the news is, whether it's good or bad, the country has continued to progress. And one of the issues we're going to face now is this thorny problem of what to do about the young people and their development to stop the issues which arise out of conflict resolution and the lack thereof. How do we do that? Well, obviously, the Minister of Education's portion of the budget has got to have much, much more. As I've said, going around the country, there is nothing that I see that money can't resolve. And this is why this bill, this amendment is important, because it is a management tool to give us the resources which we need, the funds we need to run the country, and not frighten people about, oh, you know, the money's, you know, this is unlawful, this is illegal, you've broken the law. No one's broken the law. No one's broken any law. And if it is possible in law to fix something retrospectively, that too is lawful. It's the issue. The fact is, it is for the betterment of the Bahamian people. And so I hope that the whole House supports this amendment. And I hope that what we remember in all of this, Madam Speaker, is where I started. There's fiscal policy and there's monetary policy. To me, there ought to be a synergy between the two of them, so the Ministry of Finance and the central bank are on the same page. Secondly, to deal with the question of monetary policy, the main job of the central bank is just make sure that the Bahamian dollar maintains its value. And it's doing so far a good job with that. The regulatory part, though, is the issue which concerns us. The depersonalization which has happened in banking in this country, the fact that there seems to have been a de-Bahamianization of banking functions in this country, including the approval of credit, and to ensure that the level of services are at an appropriate price point so that people are not being gouged for what is, after all, a public good, and then to resolve the issue of the debanking of these rural communities where people are suffering because they can't keep cash in the economy because there are not banks in those areas. So those are issues on behalf of the constituents of Fox Hill I raised today. I hope that those who have ears to hear will hear. And I hope that it does not become necessary for us to have a formal approach by petition of my constituents to change the public policy with regard to the legislative regime on regulation, that the preferred way to do this is for us to sit around on a bipartisan basis and map some way forward in these matters. With those few words, Madam Speaker, I rest.
Thank you, Honorable Member Asmini. The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for East Grand Bahama.
As many.
Thank you
The
very
chair
much.
recognizes the honorable member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy. Mr. Deputy, I listened to the remarks by the member for Fox Hill, and at least with respect to the position with the banks in the Family Islands, I support the comments that you were making. I believe that I can't believe any of us would not support those comments. While you are in government, I believe you have an opportunity to do something about it. And the question is whether you have the will and the support to be able to put into action those comments that were made. And I think if you were able to convince your colleagues that action should be made, we would support it. We would support it. Mr. Deputy, the Central Bank Amendment Bill is an attempt to legalize and to legitimize a fundamentally unlawful act perpetrated by the Davis administration. We on this side will not support or endorse such an act. In August of 2021, 1 month before the election, the Bahamas receives 247 million SDR allocation to bolster external reserves. This was the line, or this was the headline that was reported from the Central Bank of the Bahamas. The Central Bank reported publicly and communicated to the Ministry of Finance the following, and this is I'm speaking about in August of 2021. The Central Bank, and I'm quoting from their release, the Central Bank intends to use the SDR's allocation for foreign reserve management operations. In particular, holding them available for any increase in foreign exchange needs expressed through public and private sectors. So the Central Bank in August decided that they would take possession of these SDRs and that they would allocate the SDRs for foreign reserves. They go further in their release though, and it takes us to why we are here today. And this is again from the Central Bank. The Bahamas' SDR allocation are not being earmarked for lending to the government, and do not increase the central bank's ability to lend to the government. The lending limits remain fixed by law. This is what the central bank said at the time, in August of 2021, at the time the SDRs, they took possession of the SDRs. They said they are not earmarking it for lending to the government, and do not increase the central bank's ability to lend to the government. So as far as the central bank is concerned, once they took possession of those SDRs, which they said they were going to allocate for their foreign reserves, the only way the government could use it is to lend it to the government, as far as the central bank is concerned, from their own release. However, these allocations improve space from the central bank to relax the remaining foreign currency conservation measures. The Central Bank Act provides under Section 21 that the central bank only permits the bank to offer short-term loans, and here's the important point that the central bank's lawyers picked up on: short-term loans and direct or indirect advances to the government. And they are prevented from making those indirect or direct advances to the government only in certain circumstances.
The chair recognizes the honourable member for Fox Hill.
Sorry. Well, I know it's not question time, but the member yielded.
Go ahead.
So what I'm trying to understand is, if you go one step beyond that, though, beyond where you were, not starting at the central bank, is it not correct that the IMF itself made a particular point about these monies that were advanced to the central bank? Right. So let's hear that story. Okay.
Thank you, honourable member.
Get to that. I can get to that. I can get to that. Yeah, there are, but I'm giving mine. I'm giving mine. Yeah. The Central Bank Act, Section 21, prevents, stops, you cannot, short-term loans and indirect or direct advances to the government only under certain circumstances. Now, what you are doing today, the amendment that you are making today, is to say that the SDRs do not form a part of Section 21. That Section 21 does not apply to the SDR allocation. So if you are, through this amendment, saying that the SDRs are not a part of Section 21, then it goes without saying that right as we stand today, Section 21 prevents you from drawing down on those allocations. In fact, Section 21, subsection 1 says that aside from the limited exceptions noted above, the central bank shall not make any direct or indirect advances to the government or any state-owned enterprise. Mr. Deputy, the Prime Minister referred to the frequently answered questions, or frequently asked and answered questions. So I wish to refer you to the actual IMF guidance notes, the actual IMF guidance notes require that member states follow their own domestic law in making use of the SDR allocation. So the IMF says, here is what you could use these allocations for. But in deciding what you are going to use the allocation for, you must take into account your domestic law and whether your domestic law allows you to do what you want to do. So you can't just use the guidance notes by itself. You must use the guidance notes because the guidance note says, check your domestic law first. It is subject to what your domestic law says. So, Mr. Deputy, so the argument that the SDRs could be used by the government is dependent upon the law that allows it to happen. So until Parliament makes this amendment, until they pass this amendment, that's both houses, until you pass this amendment, what you are doing is still contrary to Section 21 of the Central Bank Act. I go further. The IMF guidance notes that I refer to and it was referred to by the leader. Under Section 27 of the IMF guidance notes, and here's what Section 27 says. A member's decision on lending arrangements should be informed by the financial autonomy considerations of their central bank. Is the central bank independent? Is the central bank separate and apart from the government? Or is the central bank a part of the government? These include, one, whether the on-lending balances fall into the statutory limits or prohibitions on the credit to the government. Now, remember what was said before by the governor of the central bank. He says these are set for the reserves of the country. They are not meant for on lending to the government because our lending restrictions have not changed. They are governed by law. So as far as the governor of the central bank is concerned, or as far as the central bank was concerned back in August of 2021, they could not do it because they were limited by law. This is what the guidelines say. These include whether the on-lending balances fall within the statutory limits or prohibitions on credit to the government. Also look at footnote 22, right below that. For the purposes of this note, on-lending is described as the central bank's lending to the government agencies the proceeds from the exchange of SDRs for freely usable currency, consistent with the domestic, legal, and institutional framework. Again, it says, yes, you could use this for these particular reasons. You could either use it for your reserves, or you can lend it to the government. But it is still subject to what your own domestic law says. What is your domestic law's lending limits? Central banks may face restrictions, and this is what is in the guidelines. This is not something that we are making up. This is what is actually in the IMF guidelines. It says central banks may face restrictions or may altogether be prohibited to lend to the government in perpetuity which in our case, the central bank under Section 21 prevents the advances, indirect or direct advances to the government only in certain circumstances. Staff advice, and I'm again reading from the central bank's guidance notes, staff advice should thus strongly emphasize the importance of ensuring that any fiscal use of the SDR allocation be consistent with domestic institutional frameworks and procedures. So they are saying, regardless of what the IMF says you could use this for, check your own domestic law first and see whether or not you are allowed to, and what are the restrictions that are being placed on it. We find that in the Central Bank Act. I would suggest Section 21 of the Central Bank Act. Mr. Deputy, I wish to remind you again, I spoke to the Central Bank Act provides under Section 21, which says that you are prevented from taking advances, indirect or direct, except under those specific circumstances. Mr. Deputy, we know that the press reports that the government and the Ministry of Finance executed a MOU to explain the entire situation. That was referred to by the leader. It was also spoken about by the Prime Minister. The MOU between the government and the central bank is very, very telling. The government received advice from the central bank's external lawyers that this transaction was unlawful. It is also my belief that the central bank would not proceed with the transaction unless this amendment was actually proceeded with. They said, we can have you sign an MOU, and in that MOU, you are going to commit to putting in place this amendment. The Memorandum of Understanding signed by the Prime Minister and the Governor of the Central Bank says this, and I quote, based on the advice of its external legal counsel, the bank is of the view that one, using the 2021 SDR allocation for the purpose would create a liability from the government to central bank. That it is undeniable that what is happening here creates a liability on the government, or creates a liability on central bank to the government. But notwithstanding Section 4(6) of the Act, and then 2, a position could be taken, which we in this place take that position, a position could be taken that the government would have exceeded the authorization borrowing limits set forth by Section 21. So the very same position that I spoke about, the very same position that the leader spoke about, that all of us on this side have spoken about, saying you have exceeded your borrowing authority under the Central Bank Act by doing this, is the very same point that the external lawyers who advised the central bank said, and they put it in their Memorandum of Understanding. I don't know who their lawyer is.
Don't answer the question.
But Mr. Deputy, we on this side heard about, when we on this side heard about the transaction, this is precisely the position that we have been speaking about.
Yes.
When we heard about it, it's precisely what we said. They were advised of it, and we also were advised of the same point. And the government knew full well about this position. They signed it knowing full well what the legal position was. Now I go further. In April of 2022, the IMF in their review of the Bahamas, when the IMF spoke about the Bahamas, this is what they said about the SDRs. They said the authorities plan to keep the SDRs as reserves, given legal limits on central bank lending to the government. So the IMF acknowledged that there are limits, there are legal limits, and so they're going to stay as reserves. So what you are doing again is contrary to what Section 21 allows you to be able to do. The authorities plan to keep the SDRs as reserves, given the legal limits on the central bank lending to the government, which, and here's the other part that they said, which is appropriate given the uncertain balance of payment outlook. They say this is what the central bank says. They can leave it there. Because of the legal limits, they can leave it there. And we believe that it is an appropriate thing to do given the balance of payment outlooks. Now we move to December of 2022. In the central bank's review of economic and financial developments, this is what the central bank says. Preliminary estimates reveal that during the second quarter of the financial year 2022-2023, the government's overall deficit widened relative to the comparative quarter of 2021-2022. Let's stop right there. In essence, they're saying the deficit got bigger this year than it was last year in that second quarter of the year. Underlying this term, or underlying this outturn, spending recovery paced faster than the VAT-led growth in revenue. You spent more than you were making. This is again in the central bank's report. Buoyant by improving economic conditions. Budgetary financing was mainly obtained from internal sources and a drawdown of the IMF special drawing rights. You overspent. You spent more than you made. Yes. It created a vacuum. It created an issue. It created a larger deficit than you anticipated. And you needed to fill that deficit. So what do? I go ahead and take the funds from the central bank, take the SDRs from the central bank, which belong to the central bank. It belonged to the central bank until there was an agreement to lend to the government.
That's correct.
It belonged to the central bank until there was an agreement to lend to the government.
That's correct.
And let me then go further, Mr. Deputy. The MOU states expressly that it is expressed. What the MOU states was that you must include in this amendment, it must expressly exclude the 2021 SDR allocation and the use and subversion of the SDR allocation for this or for the purpose. So what the central bank, what the MOU spoke about was that once you change the law to allow for the 2021 allocation, then we're fine. But you went a little further. You actually changed the law not just for the 2021 allocation, but you changed the law for the 2021 allocation and all other allocations going forward. So, what you again have not taken into account, or you may have taken into account and may have decided otherwise. But as far as the central bank was concerned, just deal with the 2021. But you have decided, I'm going to deal with the 2021 and I'm going to go further. All other allocations that the IMF prepares from now on until onward, you are now able to do it. Mr. Deputy, the Bahamian people have yet to receive a satisfactory answer from this government as to why it decided to circumvent the law and access the country's external reserves in the SDRs held by the central bank. These SDRs reside, as I submit, they resided on the balance sheet of the central bank as detailed in the bank's most recent audited financial statements. They are not and have never been the property of the central bank, of the central government for reasons that are well known and are well understood. Mr. Deputy, let me read that again.
Order, members.
So that it is abundantly clear.
Say it again.
Let me read that again.
Give us protection.
They are not.
Order, members.
They are not and have never been the property of the central government for reasons which I have said before.
Yeah.
The Central Bank Act of section 17 of the Central Bank Act, subsection 2(4), unequivocally states that the IMF's SDRs are a part of the official external reserves of the central bank. So in the Central Bank Act, it says that when these SDRs come out, they then form a part of the external reserves, which is why the governor of the central bank in 2021 was absolutely right at the time when he said, these belong to the central bank to put towards the external reserves. It bolstered the external reserves. And they are not meant for on lending to the government. Clearly, the government was caught red-handed and is now bringing this legislation in an attempt to wipe the slate clean from their breaking the law. In fact, that you are bringing this now and making it retroactive to December is only proof that you broke the law. In December, what this amendment does is this amendment cleans up what you did back in December. If it didn't, why make it retroactive to December? So, Mr. Deputy, as I take my seat, it is abundantly clear that we, on this side, cannot support what is happening here today. It is a breach of Section 21 of the Central Bank Act. What it does is it cleans up or attempts to clean up, attempts to make legitimize, to make legal the unlawful act that took place back in December. The release of the central bank back in 2021 says that it would break the law. The MOU says that it would break the law, so you must do this. We on this side says that you broke the law back in 2022, December of 2022.
As is your custom.
And so you have again consistently been consistent in terms of the ways in which you break the law. Now, Mr. Deputy, in my 2 minutes, there are some very quick East Grand Bahama matters that I would wish to raise. The first is the nurses. There is a need. Member for Tall Pines, there is a need for a full-time nurse in Proceedings, We have spoken about this on many occasions, and every time I go to Sweden Ski, I am reminded that they are still waiting the necessary changes to the nurses' facility in order for that full-time nurse to be there. They are also waiting for the full-time nurse in the High Rock Clinic. The full-time nurse has to travel from Freeport to High Rock, and then also has to travel from High Rock to McLeanstown and to Sweetings Key. And what they informed me was that they are only awaiting for the ministry's approval to put her in a place that has already been allocated, that has already been there. I was saying that's what has been advised to me. But there is a place that, I am told there is a place that is there, and that they are, it is ready for the person to go in. Also, they have now been told that residents who go to who go to the clinics, particularly High Rock, now have to pay. And I understand that all other places in the Bahamas, or most other places in the Bahamas and other clinics, you also have to pay, but they are now being informed that you have to pay. And these are residents, these are elderly residents who are in desperate need of these medical facilities, and unfortunately, many of them may not be in a position to pay. And we hope that they are not being turned away if they are not able to pay. And so given the fact that there is not a full-time nurse that's there, given the fact that these residents are still, many of them still recovering from Hurricane Dorian, still in a desperate situation, they are now being told that they have to pay. Also, member for Western and Bimini, we are eagerly awaiting the opening of the office, the social services office and the urban renewal office. I know that at one point there was a call that was said that we were going to, y'all were going to open it, but that was postponed. So we are eagerly awaiting when that is going to happen, as well as the member for Pinewood. Also, we were told that a national insurance office was also going to be opened in East Grand Bahama. And so we are awaiting what the status of that opening up the office in East Grand Bahama also is going to be. We also were informed that, there was a big meeting, and I wrote down everything that you all said at the big meeting. I did. I wrote it down because I believed that I was going to have to come back and remind you about all the promises that you all made at that big meeting. And so we also are awaiting the opening of the preschool that you said was going to happen months and months ago. You said a preschool was going to happen. You even called the name of the church that you were going to open the preschool in.
Honorable member,
this was,
20 minutes later.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Thank you. This was. I understand you were not there, you were not there, and I will speak to you offline as to who went in the public meeting and spoke on your behalf.
Your deputy.
But there was some people who went in the meeting and who said that this was going to happen. In fact, they didn't just spoke about the preschool happening at a particular church. They also spoke about a primary school that was supposed to happen. And again, Engliston, you weren't there, so I'm not holding you to that. But I hold the person who said it to it, because they went and they told the people that. I pointing all over. But Mr. Deputy, also in the DRA also, we were also told in the DRA about all of the houses that were going to be repaired and built. Repaired and built. And so, unfortunately, we are still awaiting when these houses are going to be repaired, and we are most definitely waiting when these houses are going to be rebuilt. So, Mr. Deputy, East Grand Bahama, as was said by our leader, East Grand Bahama does not support the Central Bank Amendment Bill.
Thank you, Honorable Member. As many, the chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Pine Ridge.
If I may, Mr. Deputy, I didn't want to interrupt the good member for East Grand Bahama. If I may, Mr. Deputy, with the two matters raised, I can't speak to who made the representation on an NIB office in East Grand Bahama. While I do not have a problem with it, because I think there's one in the Western End, I would like for him to tell me who made the promise, and I'll investigate that. With regards to the DRA, I said in this place, I think last week, that after speaking with the financial secretary and also the executive chairman and acting director of the DRA, funds will be made in the sum of drawdowns of about $250,000 a month moving forward as it relates to home repairs in East Grand Bahama and also in South Abaco until the new budget come in. So there should be a minimum payment into into the DRA of about $250,000. Plans are already on the way. I would have spoken to the leader of the opposition who made a request for at least one person. And hopefully we can assist as much as we can moving forward until we get into a new budgetary year with new funding.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Member. As many, the chair recognizes the Honorable Member for Tall Pines.
I want to interrupt the member for East Grand Bahama when he spoke about some things that are happening in his constituency, particularly in High Rock and Sweetens Key. Your information is not very accurate, and I want the residents of Sweetens Key and High Rock to understand that a nurse for Sweetens Key and a nurse for High Rock is present. The problem that we're having is to find the appropriate accommodation for the nurse for both Sweetens Key and High Rock. The member for East Grand Bahama spoke about a place that has been secured. As of Friday of last week, my team from the Public Hospitals Authority was in Grand Bahama to assess the situation, and the situation appears to be a little bit more complicated than the member for East Grand Bahama alluded to. The members for East Grand Bahama or the residents for East Grand Bahama can rest assured that the minute as we accommodate and have secured accommodation for our nurses with safety, we will be providing those services 24 hours a day. It is an inconvenience, but since Hurricane Dorian, it is very difficult to find the appropriate residence that meets the necessary standard for our nurse to reside in those communities 24 hours a day. So we're working diligently, and we have a new lead that we believe may resolve the problem, and the minute is that done, the residents for East Grand Bahama can rest assured that the Ministry of Health and Wellness will provide those services 24 hours a day.
Thank you, Honorable Member. The chair recognizes the Honorable Member for West Grand Bahama and Bimini.
To the member for East Grand Bahama, you are correct. I was at one of the meetings, and just to assure you that the Urban Renewal and Social Service Office in East End and Urban Renewal and Social Service Offices in West End both will open next month. Mr. Deputy, it's an appropriate time for us to now take the lunch break. So we do stand suspended until 3 o'clock this afternoon.
Is there a seconder?
Second.
It has been moved and seconded that the business of the House be suspended to 3 p.m. As many as are in favor will remain seated. Those opposed will stand. The motion is carried. The business of the House stands suspended to 3 p.m.
Detach everything, reduces and import.